Hello, Stuart.
Hi, April.
Could you please tell me a little bit about your soils experiences?
I never started out interested in soil. I was actually interested in marine biology. To understand marine biology really well, I would go off and study first a terrestrial system. And I wasn't even thinking about soil, I was just thinking about a terrestrial system. And then somebody offered me the possibility to do a PhD in a cave in Trinidad, studying the whole ecology of the system. Quite soon after that, I realized that actually, because there are 250,000 bats in the cave, there was an enormous amount of bat guano, and that's like a very fertile soil. So studying the life in the cave ended up mostly studying the bat guano, the life in the bat guano. Preconditioned me for studying soil. And the only person who'd written extensively in English about soil was a man called Keith Kevin from England. And then, knowing he was the world authority on soils, I wrote to him very cheekily and said, "I've selected you to work with next." And he was quite impressed by this approach. So I came to study with him, as a research associate, thinking I was going to be carrying out research under his direction. And when I got there, he said, "Oh, I'm glad you've arrived. You can take over soils now. I'm going to study grasshoppers." So I ended up backing into having to study soil, running as fast as I could to understand life in the soil. But I developed all sorts of techniques that were quite innovative to extract animals from soil and count the microbes and study the dynamics of soil. So I applied all this stuff I'd learned in a cave on bat guano to soil in general. And then I was pretty horrified because I was in a faculty of agriculture at McGill University, and they taught about soils without actually talking about the life in the soil. And so I said to them, you need to include stuff on the life in the soil. It's not a dead system, it's a living system. Mm-hmm. And so I was allowed to come and give one lecture in this course on soils. And I thought, the other staff who taught in this would come and attend, but they didn't, only the students came. So the soil scientists never learned anything about life in the soil, but the students did. And then I started teaching a whole course on soil animal ecology. Initially was a bit of a hidden place where people could study organic farming and permaculture and sustainable agriculture and everything, because it was much too early to get those courses accepted. But it became widely known among the students that if you did soil animal ecology, you would also learn about sustainable and ecological agriculture. Mm. And I became fascinated with soil. I went on to write a key for all the main groups of insects that live in soil, which are mostly the immatures of insects, and wrote a whole lot of papers on soils.
Why should we care about soil?
Well, we need to care about soils for a number of reasons. It's the source of our food. It supports the space that we live in. It's also the home for all the other species on land that we share on the planet. It has a really important role. And if you look at agriculture, agriculture is mostly seen as a production and consumption system, but it's actually a production, consumption, recycled system. So the waste from the production and consumption needs to go back to the soil, and that's where it can be decomposed to provide nutrients for the next lot of plants growing for the production. Our lack of understanding of this has led to a gradual degradation of soil. So we harvest the produce off the land and then stick it in waste and dump it, whereas that waste actually needs to be recycled back to the land. The trucks that carry food from the rural areas to the cities need to take all the waste that's decomposable back to the land that the crops came from. So that's a basic sort of understanding of cycles in nature that are really important. And once you understand that, then the question is, how do you enable that decomposition process and that recycling process to take place to ensure sustainability of that system?
If I wanted to care for my soil, what would be the steps I could do today?
If you think of it in relation to our relationships with humans, you know, the first statement would be, if you want to form a relationship with another human, it would be to spend some time with them and observing them and listening to them and possibly carrying out small, non-intrusive, meaningful experiments with them. And so it is with soil. We need to spend time in soil. You know, people sit on the grass, but they don't realize that there are thousands of species busily carrying on under their part of their anatomy that rhymes with grass. Once you sort of understand that, there's a whole nother world. You know, we get excited about finding life on the moon or on another planet. In fact, there was an entomologist who was so insulted by the amount of money that was spent trying to get somebody to the moon to find if there was life on the moon, recognizing how we hardly had any understanding of life under the soil. He wrote a book called on this called Life on a Little Known Planet. Understanding that when you look out on the landscape and you see cows and wildlife and trees and fields and so forth, however much biomass and diversity you see above the ground, there's orders of magnitude more biomass and diversity under the ground that we don't see, but it's mostly very small. I mean, other than plant roots, it's very small, except for fungi. Some fungi are as big as the forests, you know, and they often extend across the forest and enable communication between plants. So that world is an amazing world that exists there. But all that microbiological life in the soil, interesting as it is actually all being managed by the animals in the soil. Even though we've moved forward from a sort of physical and chemical understanding of soil to more of a microbiological understanding, even the microbiology understandings are just scratching the surface. And, you know, there are a lot of soil microbiologists compared to the amount of soil animal ecologists. And it's really soil animal ecologists who have a real deep understanding of the soil, because the organisms they study are the ones that are essentially managing that soil system. So if we want to look after the soil, what we've actually got to do is cater to the needs of the animals in soil, and particularly the small animals like mites and springtails and small insects and all their relatives.
Well, what are their needs?
You could see in terms of space, in terms of real estate, it's made up of 3 areas. Well, it's got the particles, some of which are inorganic and some of them are organic, like dead organic matter. And then there's the water film around those. And in that water film, there's aquatic organisms, particularly protozoa and nematodes, and a few other groups of organisms. And then in the spaces between those particles and in the spaces between the water, there are microarthropods and their relatives. And they're, in a sense, wandering around up to their knees in water And the ones that are in the water film are primarily feeding on bacteria, and the ones in the air spaces are feeding primarily on fungi, which are growing up out of the organic matter as they decompose it. And so they're sort of browsing on the fungi just in the same way as cows and sheep and kangaroos and so forth might be grazing on forage. But they've actually been farming those fungi for 40 million years. Now, I'm always hopeless at numbers, so it may even be 400 million years. And they do that by, if you look at a leaf, it may be broken down by a succession of different fungi and bacteria, but particularly the fungi. And each of those fungi will produce spores as well as hyphae. Hyphae are just like the solid part of the fungi. The mites and the springtails and their relatives are browsing on these fungi. Now, each of those different species have preferences. So they will be not only preferentially feeding on different species, but they'll be, in quotes, farming those different species. So they will browse on the fungi, eating the hypha and the spores. And unlike us that has a mucus lining to the gut, they actually have a little, it's like an extension of the outside of the animal, which is called the peritrophic membrane. It's like a little sleeve that is inside the gut. And when they eat the hypha and chomp it up, it's formed into a little package, and then they poop it out. And in the process, they cast off a little bit of peritrophic membrane around that package. So the mite will digest the hypha, like the stalk, and not digest the spore, which will produce more fungi of the species they prefer to feed on. So in a way, when they're wandering around in the soil pooping, they're actually dropping little bits of potting soil with the seeds, in this case, the hyphae, the spores of the species they prefer to feed on. But not only that, their bodies are covered in hairs, and their hairs are highly complex. They're not just like a straight pointy bit. They're sculptured, and those sculptures are designed so that when they're wandering through a field of fungi with spores, those hairs will preferentially pick up the spores of the species they prefer to feed on. And in that process, in those two ways, they're distributing the spores of their food source throughout the soil. So it's a highly complex system. There will be several dozen species of these mites and springtails doing this, each distributing different spores, each of which are producing fungi which are needed for the proper decomposition of the organic matter in the soil. So the key to maintaining soil is returning organic matter to soil, which will then enable the fungi to have some food, and then in turn up the food chain, the microarthropods to have some food and be enabling them to carry out their function. In addition to all those things, of course, there are a whole lot of predators, which are bigger, more ferocious mites and pseudo-scorpions and centipedes and some insects that are predatory. Well, we might become a little itchy because actually all of us have mites in our skin that live in our skin, in our brow and around our nose, and interesting, particularly for women, around the nipple. And so that's how those mites are passed on from one generation to the next through breastfeeding, and that's why we have them around the nose and in the brow. One great writer said many, many years ago, we're standing on the top of a fascinating other world. you know, most people who study agriculture have no idea about these things, and most people in the general population have no idea. Sustainability really means maintenance of life-enabling systems. The main life-enabling system that we need to pay attention to, or two life-enabling systems. One is the aquatic systems, but more important, because we've neglected it much more, is the soil system.
Thank you.
Because you are talking to a complete addict for understanding life in the soil and loving life in the soil. And particularly for me, because there's quite a number of those organisms which I discovered in soil that have been named after me. So I have a particular relationship with life in the soil, because some of them have the same last name as me. Microdina hilli is a teleid beetle that lives in it. Well, I found it in the bat guano, and it's probably the smallest beetle in the world. And it lives at the edge in the cave between the fruit bat guano and the insectivorous bat guano. And this is an interesting thing, particularly in relation to permaculture, because one of the things that make permaculture particularly effective is that it's a design process that creates fertile edges. So instead of having a field of all one species, you have a whole complexity, and it's creating those edges between those different groups of plants that actually is responsible for it being a productive system with fewer pests and better decomposition and all the other sort of things. So that whole process of managing complexity is really important in managing the soil. So for example, if you were watering a row of plants, it's really important to only water on one side, so that one side is a bit drier and the other side a bit wetter. And that enables the life in the soil to go to wherever is the most attractive moisture level in the soil, which can vary over time. And this was really discovered in an understanding of that came from sewage systems, where they had these enormous round areas which had sewage in, and they had a rotating spray that sprayed the sewage on these rocks, and it was being decomposed. They found sometimes the sewage would block up some of the spray nozzles, and people would think, oh dear, we've got to get it clean. And then they did a bit of a study to see how the decomposition was going on. And they actually found the decomposition worked better when some of the nozzles were blocked, which meant the organisms that were breaking down the dead organic matter could actually move, depending on their preference, moisture between the blocked area and the unblocked area. So, you know, we often learn things through mistakes, but it was an important learning. Overruling of, you know, living productive systems by engineers has been the downfall of a lot of these systems, because the engineer wants to create a uniform system, and the biological system actually functions when it's a variable system in time and space. And you can see this particularly in chicken houses. You know, the initial strategy was to create uniform temperatures and lighting conditions for the chickens in chicken houses and pig houses and so forth. And they actually found that if you had put it on a timer that made the light come on and off and the temperature go up and down, the chickens were produced more eggs than if it was a uniform system. So we really have got a long way to go in understanding those sort of wisdoms of nature.
I don't want to make you cry, but you must be reflecting on how much damage agriculture does to the world. That must be difficult to encourage individuals to try and make a change on that scale. So what can an individual do to encourage agriculture to change?
Let me just give you some figures before I answer that. When I first went to Canada, I was horrified to see just the vast areas of uniform landscape in the prairies, the vast fields of wheat and so forth, and the same in America with corn and so forth. A study had been done, had found that we'd lost 60% of the organic matter in the soil, those soils, in the previous 30 years. Now, if you put a value on that, that was multiple times the value of the national debt, which people were talking about and worrying about, but there was no worrying about the organic matter in the soil. And when I ran workshops for farmers and graziers across the prairies, it was difficult to get them to think what else they could do, because they were paid for production, which was how much produce they could pull off that land. They weren't paid anything for maintenance of the system. So that's the challenge facing agriculture, is finding a way to pay for maintenance. And I know when I got associated with organic farming, people said, oh, I don't know, it's more expensive, organic food. And I said, well, you're actually paying for maintenance, because when you ask people who are buying organic food why they're buying it, they usually say, I think it's better for my health and I think it's better for the environment, which is the beginning of a culture being willing to pay for maintenance functions. And that's the sort of behavior that we've got to expand if we're going to take sustainability really seriously. So we've got to pay for maintenance.
Beautiful.
And it's the same in relationships between people.
All right, noted. So one more question, if I may. What led you to look beyond the soil?
Okay, so how I expanded my interests, just in the same way as I became fascinated with soil I enabled myself to develop my understanding of soil by writing to and connecting with the World Authority on this. I've done the same thing in every other area that has been fascinating to me. And so I got involved with the people who did the only large-scale long-term study of health, which was called the Peckham experiment. Yeah. And I understood, what enables health. And then while I was trying to work with farmers and students to take more responsible approaches to agriculture and soil and so forth, at that time, my marriage was going through a difficult period. And my partner went and did some psychology and therapy. And being a classic chauvinistic male, I said, well, good, she's going to work out her problems and we can get on with our so-so marriage. But she came back from this stuff and it really looked interesting. And I went off and did a session with the same people. And I was absolutely blown away and instantly became hooked on psychology and psychosociology and so forth. And so I went on to do massive amounts of therapy in numerous therapies and became a therapist. And also I was on government committees, working on policy and so forth. In all these areas, I was becoming interested in the whole process of change and what enables change. And what most change being done in society was sort of reactive, patching up, curative change that would enable the existing system to be perpetuated. And what I realized in terms of fundamental change, it required redesigning how we do things. It was a proactive front-end approach to change was very multifaceted, whereas the classic approach to change is sort of back-end, reactive, single factor, magic bullet. And it's the same still with sustainability. There's people saying, oh, we just need to put solar collectors on our roof, or we just need to have access to gas as an interim, or we just need to recycle our wastes and so forth. But actually, it's a whole redesign of the whole system that's required. And that's partly why permaculture was so interesting to me, because it's emphasizing design and how do you approach design. I still think there's a long way to go in permaculture. So most people in permaculture would not have the same understanding that I've just been sharing with you about life in the soil. And until they do, permaculture will be limited in its potential.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much, Stuart.
My pleasure.
Always a pleasure to learn and to learn from you.